Okay, thanks everyone, and thank you for the invitation to speak in this symposium. So, in these sessions, we're going to be talking about, I guess, radical, maybe, or trying to be radical in the way that we produce knowledge always. And I'm trying to kind of come up with this presentation from a perspective that I'm working in applied sciences, particularly public health, and hopefully that from the applied sciences we can also contribute to a wider kind of discussions about how we can produce knowledge that matters for knowledge itself, but also for policy and practice. So before I begin, I just would like to acknowledge the Turrbal and Jagra people, which is the traditional people in Mianjin, or otherwise known as Brisbane, because it is in this place that I developed this knowledge about race, racism, anti-racism, decolonizations. But I also come from Indonesia, the place where the Bandung Conference happened in the 1950s. And so my understanding of decolonization also comes from there. The presentation itself is based on a PhD project at the University of Queensland about sexual health of gay men from Southeast and East Asia who newly arrived there. A paper on this presentation is currently under review with qualitative research, so I can share that if it gets accepted. So let me begin. I just want to first acknowledge that when we're talking about qualitative methods in social sciences, interviews obviously still play a very dominant role. One could argue that there is a hegemony of interviews, and this has been discussed since the late 1990s by Atkinson and Silverman when they were discussing about interviews as a central mode of understanding social worlds. Now, there's a lot of critiques against this hegemony of interviews because the overuse of interviews often leads to poorly executed interviews or understanding of interviews itself. But we also kind of continue to engage with this particular method because it gives us kind of like a more direct and pragmatic way to have a discussion with another person and get them to discuss about their lives. There's obviously a long acknowledgement that these particular interactions between the interviewer and interviewee will obviously that influence the type of knowledge that comes up or is being generated through that interactions. However, when it comes to investigating race, racism, or even engaging with ethnic minoritized communities who are adversely racialized, and we want to be more sensitive to race, can be really quite challenging and difficult to first elicit the data, but also to interpret that data. Some of these challenges rooted in how race in itself is essentially a myth or a socio-historical concept to uphold white supremacy and categorization of color as inferior. And as kind of like a myth, we live at a state where for a lot of people, they have internalized that race as an identity. So we now live in an era where people are still using terms such as my race or my racial identity. So that kind of like myth has been internalized, and it does kind of have that social implication and cultural implication in one's life. And then so it can be difficult to try to kind of get people to be aware of these impacts of race. And also we get the challenges of the so-called race-mute societies such as Australia, where I did my research, Western Europe, where racism is being seen as an anomaly or an aberration, something to be dismissed, denied, not to be discussed, etc., etc. And then it also makes people become avoidant to actually discuss race and racism in an interviews. And also racism evolves often faster than the speed of anti-racism itself. So that also makes it really difficult for us to kind of really understand, okay, so what's going on now? How come racism evolved to this state, et cetera, et cetera. And then also from a methodological perspective itself, I would also argue that not all qualitative researchers are trained to do interviews in the same way. And there are a couple of factors that contribute to this. One is that the way in which research training has been provided, it's changed a lot since post-Second World War, right? In the good old days, and they say, there was a lot of more times to train people to do proper interviews. There was a story about supervisors going with the PhD students out in the field together, and then they kind of like training how to do interviews in a good way. But obviously nowadays that's not possible in most cases. I mean, myself, my first interviews, I had my supervisor. I know a couple of friends who had their supervisors in a couple of interviews that they did during their PhD training. And they've just come from a realization that actually interviews are not that easy to do, particularly for research purposes. But then also there are obviously disciplinary differences. And then there's also how qualitative research is situated in a project. For example, in a mixed method project, it may be that the qualitative component is more of an add-on, so that we have information about context. And so it's kind of like descriptive approaches often more often end up being seen as enough. So there's kind of like all of these factors that contribute to that. And so my approach is slightly different. Rather than kind of talking about like from a positionality, I'm coming from a global South scholar, etc., etc., I would like to kind of like address these kind of challenges in using interviews for racism and anti-racism from a perspective of acknowledging that there are different styles in interviewing. So maybe many of us obviously have quite used to the kind of analogy of a miner or a traveler from Kuala, but then there more recent one, there's kind of like a more nuanced sort of categorizations to interview, which is trying to define the many different interviewing styles into dosastic and epistemic interviewing. So the dosastic is more of the kind of minor, meaning that the interviewer is going into the interview encounters with the expectation that there will be something that they can excavate from the conversation, and they can just pull out. They can just do that. And so the way in which they approach the interview is that interview is an instrument or the tool to excavate that knowledge or that data. And then there's the epistemic interviews, which is like a range of interviewing style where both the interviewer and interviewee are kind of like a companion in a journey. They're in a journey together. They kind of have expectation or a destination to go, but things may happen during that journey, and these things that happen may actually reveal something about their destination or about the meaning of that journey itself or the things that they're seeking. And so this is kind of like more like interviews as a social practice, where interviews are much more kind of like being seen close to the act of conversation, right? And so between the many differences that are classified under dosastic and the many kind of different styles that are classified under epistemic, obviously there are overlaps. For an example, the issue of rapid. So rapid is still important for both. The difference is with the dosastic kind of interviewing styles, generally we kind of treat each of the participants as like the authority on the subject matters, that they can tell us everything about the social phenomenon that we're investigating, and that we need to respect that, and we shouldn't challenge that, and we need to just trust what the interviewees are saying to us. But with epistemic interviews, there is kind of like a room to kind of say, but what about, what if, what if that accounts are actually incomplete? What if that accounts actually can be contradicted? So there is this kind of room for dissent and for kind of like a healthy debate to kind of like occurs as well in that kind of generation of knowledge through epistemic interviewing. So rapid is important, but they have different purpose. For the dosastic, it really is about kind of like placing the interviewee as the authority. But with the epistemic, it's more about like seeing one participant as one expert, and therefore we can engage with in a healthy debate with humility, obviously, and respect to the participant. And so the epistemic interviewing, I would argue, can be useful if we really want to use interviews to investigate race, racism, or to be sensitive towards race, but it's not enough. And so I'm arguing that a decolonial methodologies or decolonial framework can be useful to try to kind of like stir that interviews, which is arguably a Western method, towards a decolonial direction. And so we begin with obviously acknowledging decoloniality as kind of a delinking from Western dominance, introducing knowledge. And that starts with like, what is the understanding of the researcher or the interviewer of this delinking? What does that look like? For me, I still remember like the first president of Indonesia when he opened the Bandung conference in the 1950s, he made a declaration that colonizations actually didn't stop with us declaring independence. There are still, a lot of other forms of coloniality happening. And one of them that he said in the opening was intellectual control, how we produce knowledge and what counts as knowledge. And so that, I think, is an entry for me, that actually what I'm doing now is a derivative from that kind of like political aspirations to challenge this intellectual control. And so obviously the challenge is always to how to demystify, research process to ensure that research is diverse as the researchers claim it is. What that means is that acknowledging that for a lot of like different communities, there are already existing decolonial approaches. And what I'm going to present in terms of interviewing from a decolonial perspective is not to replace this existing sort of global South ways of producing knowledge. I'm not trying to say like use this rather than that. It's not about which one is better, but it's making sure that if interview is the chosen method in your research project, that you can do it or optimize it in the best way possible so that it is decolonial. So there's obviously a lot of talk about critical reflexivity. There's a lot of talk about reciprocity, self-determination, and other ways of knowing, which is all kind of like factors that we often hear when we talk about participation or participatory method. These factors kind of already exist. But what I kind of see still as a gap in the literature is that how can we create a decolonial knowledge with heterogeneous, communities? If we're just engaging with like one particular kind of like ethnic communities with a particular specific kind of cultural codes and practices, we may be able to kind of draw or, from the cultural practices and kind of identify maybe that there are particular ways of doing qualitative research from the cultural practices. But when it's really diverse, it can be quite challenging. In public health, for example, the NHS recently established Race and Health Observatory, right? And they want to produce more knowledge about the relationship between racism and health. And a lot of under this kind of like observatory, there's going to be a lot of projects that need the researchers to engage with diverse communities. And this is what I mean that interviews may be particularly useful if we can do it in a decolonial way to produce that particular knowledge about relationship between racism and health. Okay. So I call it an epistemic interviewing being done within a decolonial framework as race-conscious conversation, which is an interviewing style that situates interviewer and interviewee as knowledge-producing partners and is sensitive towards the complex manifestation of race and racism, as well as their intersection with other structures of oppressions. So acknowledging again that interview may be kind of like rooted in a more kind of Western philosophy, particularly epistemic interviewing is often rooted in that kind of Socratic ways of having dialogue, dialectical conversation. I also would like to acknowledge that philosophers in the Global South have also considered conversation as epistemic, particularly people like Freire have always kind of talked about true dialogue and conscientização and that kind of critical consciousness and critical awakening that can occur through that process of like having conversation. So that's already there. So what I'm not trying to argue is that, oh, they're talking about the same thing. They're not necessarily talking about the same thing, but there are synergies. And it is the synergy between what is considered as the Western philosophy that roots the interview method and what could possibly interview be if we're thinking about it interdecolonially, that I'm kind of really interested, that space of kind of liminality where synergy could occur. And so from that, I kind of developed this sort of 5 principles to not to be prescriptive, but to kind of talk about the reflexive, technical, and ethical aspects of conducting interviews decolonially. So maybe you can't see it quite clearly, but I will dig into it further. But what I just want to say is that these principles are based on the understanding that race is actually ordinary. It's not aberrational. It's just like in everyday. Sometimes we are aware of it and sometimes we're not. Race serves specific purpose, whatever that is. It may be nation building, it may be specific economic purposes, etc., etc. Race is invented and reinvented by society, and therefore it keeps evolving. Race is intersectional with other structures of oppression, and race is revealed through shared critical reflexivity and consciousness. And with that, I'm trying to apply, or I'm trying not to apply, but like I'm trying to kind of understand these principles from the, my PhD project with Asian-born gay men in Australia. It was a public health project. It was not meant to study racism or anything like that. The study was actually just about sexual health literacy. And then the way that I did it is that I did 3 rounds of semi-structured interviews, which included visually mapping participant social networks using sociographs. So that was the initial setup of the study. But then I kind of understand a few things about from my PhD study. One is that if we are to think about interviews in a decolonial way, we need to kind of, again, continue this challenge towards the binary of insider-outsider. I kind of see that there are multiple levels in which we can actually challenge this binary level, from interpersonal to systemic. The interpersonal is that the kind of understanding that, you know, inside and outside may invite a priori assumption on how interviewer would build rapport and trust with interviewee. And then on a research project, we also kind of acknowledges that positionality changing can shift over time, even within a single research project. You know, on discipline level, in international development and relation, there is this kind of argument as well about how global South scholars are made to feel that they can only do research in the countries that they're from. And that actually makes them feel like, well, what about South-South cooperation? You know, if I'm just, you know, how do we build South-South cooperation in a research context? Then, if that's going to be the expectation, cool. And then sociocultural, it's about power, the lack of intersectionality that has been a lot discussed, and then on the systemic level. Inside and outside of positionality can contribute to kind of enshrine structural inequality, particularly by the use of a positionality statement that often does very little to actually reveal how power actually functions in a research project. And that comes from Ghani and Khan paper that's relatively new. So because I only have 5 minutes, I'm just going to go to the highlights. For the multi-positionality, it is, again, kind of a reminder for us to focus on what identities and categories are co-constructed, intersecting, and emerging as pertinence during interviews. So before the interviews, you know, we may have assumption, be aware of that assumption. We may use a particular category, use that category, but be ready to be critical of those categories that we use during the interviews process. And then there's the serial and active interview. Serial interviewing is could be easily understood as like using interview more than once. So I really don't recommend to use kind of like a cross-sectional interview if we are to kind of really dig deep into race, racism, and anti-racism. The frequency and interval of the interviews obviously depend on a range of factors, which you can see on my slide, but it is more about assuring that we're not just suddenly having debates with our participants, that even participants need to warm up before you debate about things with them. But if we are to kind of have a respectful dissent and allowing that room for kind of questioning and all that sort of things, then we need to first make sure that we spend enough time and build relationship with them. Active interviewing. So we can use diverse forms of knowledges. As you can see here, we can use close-ended question on why to kind of like keep the conversation reflexive and to cross-check their account and to really treat interviewee as an expert rather than an authority on the subject matter. Creative methods. This is creative methods is discussed here in relation to that serial and active interviewing and how after having conversations for so long, at some point the conversation can be really difficult to stay reflexive. And creative methods in this context of interviewing can provide a space for that reflexivity to be maintained. So what is important is to choose a creative method that obviously addresses the research question, making sure that it's epistemologically aligned with decolonial knowledge production, and then focus on enabling participant reflexivity to link individual experiences and structural factors. And I'm saying this because there's a lot of discussion about creative methods at the moment, obviously, but people often choose it based on engagement, like what would be more engaging for the participant, which is absolutely important, but it's not very clear how it addresses the research question, and it's not very clear how it's epistemologically aligned with the framework of the researcher. And also, there's a tendency to choose in applied sciences creative methods that are very systematic, but not very clear on like trying to dig deep into the link between individual and experiences and structural factors. Okay, this is about theories of race and anti-racism, just saying that interpretive analysis is essential for race-conscious conversation. There is a lack of engagement with critical theories of race and anti-racism in a lot of different disciplines. And come back to the idea of participation, I also encouraged preliminary kind of findings to be discussed with stakeholders. And I'm saying stakeholders here because this is not a member checking kind of exercise. This is more about broadening the discussion that started with the participants, with the community members, including the participants, but other community members as well, and other stakeholders like service providers, etc., etc. And then in the reporting, it's really important to kind of convey the conversational nature of the data collections by including questions or inserting participant words in the paragraphs as well. And the ethics of care, the feminist of ethics of care can be extended into race-conscious conversations. It is really about making sure that we pay attention to how we use categories towards the participants. Is there other things that other people and us need to be critical about the categories that we use? For example, Asian-born gay men can actually be a racist category because in the Australian context, Asian is almost kind of like used to refer to East Asian and Southeast Asian with the exclusion of South Asian. So that is racist, but that's what a lot of public health people are using, but they are doing that. No, we're using Asian-born, not just Asian, but you know, it doesn't change. It doesn't change the power dynamic. So yeah. Okay. So limitation: an individual who's not already conscious of race is less likely to be effective. And then there are some scholars that prefer the concept of culture over race, but that kind of contributes that kind of race mute tendency in some societies as well. And just a reminder that my presentation is not about reinventing interviews, but trying to highlight how different styles can actually be linked together within a decolonial framework to do a better research, qualitative research that use interviews on race and racism. So this is just a range of potential implications as well on what the things that we can study and contribute to. Thank you.
Thank you. So, will you stay for questions?
Sure.
Yeah. So, any questions here in the room? Or two here, three, any more?
Everybody.
So I'll start with you.
Thank you for the presentation. It was excellent.
Can you speak up just?
Yeah, okay. Thank you for the presentation. It was excellent. And I was wondering if you'd like to share a bit about how you were the experience of shifting of power and positionality whilst you were interviewing your participants.
Yeah, so definitely with each participant there is a different dynamic. You can't, it's human interactions generally we can't predict a priori to the encounter itself. You're figuring it out as you go along in the interviews. There's definitely participants who try to teach me things and say that no, you got it wrong. There's that dynamic. And then there are those who are kind of like, do you know what? I never thought about racism. You know, because I'm queer, so I'm just like, I don't think about racism, just think about queer stuff. And so there's the dynamic as well. And I think it is about kind of meeting them where they are, and then just keep tabs on like, you know, how that dynamic particularly produce a very wide range of understanding of race and racism.
Next. There's one.
Thank you for the presentation. I really like the idea of decolonizing interviews. You mentioned creative methods, and could you please elaborate how you combine creative methods with interviews while also continuing decolonizing all these methods?
Yes.
How do you bring these different approaches together?
Yes. So first of all, just want to reiterate again that creative methods is being discussed in the context of conducting interviews. So this is not interviews and then marrying with creative methods. It's more about creative methods is supporting the interview process. So I just want to clarify that first. And then first, the question was about, research question was about sexual health literacy embedded within the migrant networks of the participants. And it is because of that study of migrant networks, I went back to the literature and it gave me a couple of different ways to study networks. Obviously, the most established one is the sociogram as a creative method there, as a visual method there. Then the question is it decolonial? Then that's where I read a lot of the work from, the name is just flies. Louis Ryan for sure, but I can remember the one in Neuchâtel.
Janine Hinden?
Hinden, yes, thank you. Janine Hinden, and that's where I kind of like, because there's a lot of critique coming from her as well about, demigraticizing kind of stuff and all that sort of thing. That's what I kind of see. Also, with networks, if being done properly, you actually get a much more intersectional and more complex picture that goes beyond ethnicalizing the participants. And that's what I feel like, okay, that's epistemologically aligned with what most of the analysis try to do, which is avoiding ethnic stereotypes that often becomes a proxy to race. So that's actually quite useful. And then in the context itself, it is about making sure that there is enough time for the participant to reflect on what they've done. So if the creative methods is quite laborious for the participants, that there isn't a break for them to kind of reflect on what they've done, it can be really difficult for them to kind of follow, okay, what have I been doing? So it's making sure that there are always kind of break before you go into kind of like a big discussion. So for me, I divide the kind of question into three. First is to ask them who are the most important people in your life, and the second is who are most important people in your migration journey, and who are the most important people in your kind of sexual health. And those kind of three discussion, there's always like filling out the sociogram and then we discuss it, and filling out the sociogram again and then we discuss it. That's kind of like how I did it.
I think you want to say something about? Well, I very briefly just want to say, I think what's really important that you've touched on is letting the person decide also what the key elements of their life are in terms of it. As you say, it may not be race, it may be queerness, it may be class position rather than. So we go into these interviews and actually intersectionality doesn't help because you're forcing them to say, well, all of these things kind of are important to us, but they may not be important, And in fact, in terms of intersectionality, the problem is it's looking at those who are dispossessed. There's been a discussion going on about what about those who are in positions of power.
Yes.
And there may be powerful on one dimension and not on the other.
Yeah, I think I really follow through the kind of intersectionality thinking that it is not just about understanding how different forms of oppression kind of intersect with one another, but also about resources, which I think is quite established in the migration studies about the relationship between intersectionality and resources. And so resources is being discussed through the notion of capital. And so that was really useful. That was the breakthrough for me because it allows me to talk about my participant in a way that here are the gaps in the sexual health, but also here are the strengths. And here are like the two kind of intersect in a very complex way. So I think that was kind of like, it was just such a breakthrough for me to kind of approach intersectionality through that relationship with resources.
I have a few questions, but I'll try to focus on one. So going back to the creative dimension, you use visual map.
So sure.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about it because we're doing some mapping in one of these projects, and also how, in what sense, help you maintain reflexivity.
Reflexivity, yeah.
A link to that, you mentioned something interesting regarding the positionality statement.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which of course doesn't fulfill the complexity of our dynamic.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what are you suggesting instead?
So I really just suggest that multi-positionality is again that we can't assume about which identity that may be perceived as important by the participants. Some participants really kind of see me as like, oh, you're another Asian like me. Another one is like, oh, you're like gay like me. Like there are different part of ourselves that somehow play a different role for the participants. And for me, that's much more interesting than like me declaring like I'm Asian queer person. These are my people. I know everything. But it's not. I don't know everything and all that sort of thing. So that's about positionality. But about the question of visual mapping, I'm going to link it back to your question before to the previous presenter about participation, because the process was participatory. I really agree with Asuncion assessment about it's very useful to kind of have us interviews in the beginning before we kind of jump into more kind of creative methods to ground our understanding of what comes out of the creative methods, because that's also what happened. With sociogram, you have to identify categories to help participants to identify or to have some sort of prompts to think about relationship in their life. But who decide those categories are? Some people decided based on the literature, and they say we're going to look at family, friends, etc., etc. But in my case, I look at like the first interview in the first round. What are the relationships that comes out of that? And then through that 3 round, it becomes much more streamlined, because in this when I went out to the participant, there were like 12 categories that were kind of important. But in the papers and in my thesis, there were only 5 that kind of capture the different kind of relationships. But that's kind of what I was saying before, that really just giving them the kind of agency to drive that. Something online.
Yes, have you got anybody online with questions? Check the chat box. Can you unmute yourself? I can't see any hands, so So please, if you have questions, then unmute yourself and speak.
Thank you. Excellent presentation. I wrote a lot of notes, and I also studied in IQ, so I want to talk to you more later as well. But I was very taken from many things you said, and made me think one of the points I wanted to discuss more was around the closing slides about culture versus race.
Yeah.
And this is because I'm a PhD in Australia, at the university. My title was cultural meanings of suicide, and I had a lot of debates with myself about how should I frame my work, and I chose not to use race. Because based on understanding of race as more a genetical, kind of biological kind of element, so wanted to point more towards what even said, to beliefs, norms that are shared by people who might be sharing the same language, affiliation, and perhaps race, but maybe not. So that's so my choice of my work for 1 to 2 decades has been around the culture, which can include race. And ethnicity and other things. But then when you say this thing, maybe I just choose the wrong word. Maybe there's other implication of talking about culture than race, which I didn't fully understand. So if you can help me to understand that.
So for me, just want to clarify that the reason why I chose or highlight limitations that some scholars may prefer culture over race, it's not that necessarily I'm thinking that their thinking is wrong. Yeah, and it was more about kind of like the understanding that sometimes that race gets dismissed, but the justification to dismiss race for me is not strong enough. Like what you just said, that makes sense to me. But then some researchers are not giving kind of a strong justification. Peer reviewers, particularly editors of journals, sometimes they just kind of like, why not using culturally competent? And I'm just like, but why the dismissal of race before you jump into the culture debate? I think that's more kind of like I was highlighting that there are gaps in that. But I totally agree that concept of race is not actually like I'm just thinking in terms of like Raghuram's paper about racism in Asia and how that there are different sort of like lens that we need to use to understand that are we trying to investigate how racism in Asia contributes to the global racism, or are we trying to understand specific forms of racism that occur in Asia that may actually have different names? That is not racism at all. And so I thought I was kind of like referring to that to that as well. And I think that kind of like local context specific is absolutely important. I think. Yeah. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. So our next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you.
So our next speaker is Yena Bayramoğlu. He's a lecturer in sociology at the University of York, and I'm just getting.
Well, hello everyone, I'm Yena Bayramoğlu. I'm a lecturer in sociology at the University of York. But I'm actually coming from media studies, so somehow I ended up in sociology. Therefore, I have now a term for myself. I'm a sociologist of media, or a media ethnographer. And my work focuses on the meaning of digital media, but I also conduct research on migration, borders, queer theory, and temporalities. And in the past, I did a research on Middle Eastern queer refugees escaping war and homophobia and transphobia. And that was a multi-sided research, and I was particularly interested in understanding the meaning of digital media for their strategies of migration and navigation. And so I did field work in Istanbul, but also in Berlin. I attended regular meetings in queer migrant organizations, but also LGBT organizations. But in the recent years, I shifted my attention more towards migration, queer migration from Turkey to Europe, particularly to Germany and the UK. And today I will be talking about that research. But before that, I would like to also talk about digital ethnography, because digital ethnography is the method that I have been preoccupied for a very long time. But I have also some dissatisfaction with the method itself, and I'm trying to experiment with it and to think further to include more participatory methods and creative methods in digital ethnography. But what is digital ethnography? Similar to other ethnographic observations, digital ethnography seeks to explain practices, and usually everyday practices, that appear irrational from one perspective by providing rich descriptions of the cultural logics of the research group. And I mean irrational because when you look at all this like digital culture, some popularity of memes or why certain videos suddenly become popular or funny might appear illogical, but in order to decode and understand the meaning and the logics of behind why certain digital cultural artifacts become popular, you need time. And time is the most important component of digital ethnography. So it translates or interprets the logics, practices, relationships, values of digital culture, and requires adaptation to account for the nature of digital information. Digital information is always traceable but ephemeral, easily copied, transmitted quickly and globally. So it's always transnational, even if it's a communication between two individuals living in the same country, we use in the end transnational platforms. But it is also that's the general problem methodologically. Digital information is always ephemeral. In the past, I did a research on Haraga videos, for instance. These are videos recorded by migrants crossing the borders and uploaded later on YouTube and TikTok, because states consider these videos as illegal because they depict how migrants cross the borders. They are banned and censored. So there lies the methodological challenge. You need to in such moments, you need to also immediately document the digital culture, because tomorrow you might not find such videos or images. And there are different ways of conducting digital ethnography, and it's also a bit of disciplinary decision. Some scholars focus on observations only on online platforms. Usually these are media and communication scholars, so it's the digital ethnography is purely based on online observations. And anthropologists, for instance, they shift their attention away from online platforms to everyday situations. They observe the meaning of digital technologies and digital media in everyday situations. And some scholars, and this is me, they like to combine these two different approaches to understand digital media technologies. So they combine or they use multiple methods in that sense. And there is a computational turn in social sciences because of all these algorithmic tools and digital tools. You are able to collect a big amount of data from social media platforms. And digital ethnography, on the other hand, is based on small data. It's, I would say, even an antithesis of all this like big data research. So small data is for qualitative research on digital media, we need to reduce the data while enhancing its depth and thickness. It is too small for statistical representations, small enough for human researchers, so not algorithms or computers, to produce detailed representation of the phenomena, because you will in the end collect manually the data from social media platforms or digital media. Small data allows to capture the specificity of the users, of their motives, and what digital practices mean for individuals. Qualitative research with small data can also allow researchers to address and mitigate risks concerning ethics much easier, because big data analysis, in the end, would collect thousands and even hundreds of thousands posts, and it's impossible to ask informed consent by the users. While small data research and digital ethnography always enables informed consents, it enables also or respects the agency of the users, and therefore it's much easier to mitigate such ethical risks. And I like this metaphor of spaghetti, and I also talk about this when I teach about digital ethnography, because I think in order to reach the level of thickening data, you need to combine different data forms. And so in the end, your explanations and your data needs to be like spaghetti entangled. In order to understand the meaning of a post or a video, you will need to combine the interview data. In order to understand the interview data, you will need the images or posts you've collected from social media. And all this needs to be also explained by the long-term observations in digital platforms. So like a spaghetti, you will need to also cook your material. So you will need time. And as I mentioned also earlier, time is the most important component in digital ethnography. So your data needs time, your data needs to cook slowly in that sense.
Well, al dente, yes. You don't want to overcook.
Yes, also not yeah. And there are some binaries within or among scholars engaging with digital technologies or digital ethnography, which I would like to undermine or question. There is usually an either-or approach in digital ethnography. Usually scholars either only focus on online observations or they conduct non-digital centric approaches. They only look at the human condition in everyday situations. And I think we need to combine online and offline spaces, online and offline observations, because also in media studies, these divisions, these binaries are questioned. Like we cannot think anymore physical spaces as disentangled from online technologies, or digital technologies are always a reflection of what we do in the physical spaces. So these spaces are always entangled, and the methodologies need to also reflect that entanglement. And there is also a binary between empowerment and dystopian approaches, particularly in the earlier research done on digital media, particularly in digital migration, for instance. There was a big emphasis on empowerment. Scholars were thinking, oh, digital media will empower migrants, it will bring democracies, there was also this utopian understanding of of digital technologies. No, but nowadays, then it has shifted towards dystopian approaches. Scholars are more interested in understanding how digital technologies become surveillance mechanisms, how they are used in migration and border control, or how big tech collects data from also migrants. And these are more dystopian approaches. But I think we need to also go beyond it. We shouldn't get stuck in those binary thinking, because digital technologies are ambivalent technologies, and we need to understand the ambivalences of these technologies. People will continue to use these technologies despite all their dangers and dystopian reflections. So this is the research that I have done most recently. It was funded first by Marie Curie actions by European Commission, but thanks to Brexit, that was like cancelled, but UKRI then jumped in and I got still the funding, but by UKRI, not the European Commission. And that research focused on media practice of belonging within Turkey's queer diaspora in Germany and the UK. It was between 2022 and 2024. It was a multi-sided research in Berlin and London. And I particularly focused on the meaning and role of digital media in queer diaspora formation across borders. And Turkey's queer diaspora is an important case because, particularly since the Gezi protest, there's an increasing repression of human rights, and particularly LGBTIQ rights, which also pose a situation of an increase of migration, a significant rise of migration from Turkey to Europe, and people choose Germany and UK not only due to existing networks of friends and family, but also because of the promise of a safer life, free from state-driven homophobia and transphobia. This is a promise, but of course, migration is never a teleological or one-way journey from repression to liberation. People continue experiencing discrimination in Europe, so we should always reflect this, messiness of migration stories. And migration from Turkey to Europe has a long history, with Turkish and Kurdish diaspora forming the largest ethnic minorities, particularly in Germany. So that's why the project was focused on Germany and also the UK. And so I will, as part of this research project, I'm collaborating with an artist. He himself is a queer migrant. And we're trying to visualize different data points. Some of them are based on my field notes, ethnographic observations in everyday situations. Some of the visualizations are based on my online observations, so they re-narrate the online communication. But some of these illustrations are drawn from interview excerpts. They visualize the interview situation. And I will give some examples. And this is based on a field note, and I will read the field note with the hope that it will make sense why the artist has chosen this image. So it's the story of Zeynel. Zeynel's path has been fragmented. His journey, a restless loop between Turkey, Italy, France, and now Germany. Not by choice, but by necessity. His HIV positive status, coupled with homophobia embedded in Turkey's healthcare system, made staying there untenable. And yet, even in Europe, belonging remains elusive. Long hours in a restaurant kitchen, exhaustion replacing community, left little space for queer life and encounter. Even dating apps remained untouched. There was simply no time. Our conversation unfolded in his studio and compact space where life, work, and solitude converged. A sleek smart TV dominated the room, silently streaming a video game, a lone hero traversing vast landscapes, leaping over obstacles. The imagery was uncanny, a digital echo of Zeynel's own migrations, his own quiet odyssey. Music hummed through the space, floating from speakers synced to his smartphone. As the interview ended, he swiftly gathered his dishes, preparing to leave for another long shift in the restaurant kitchen. Before stepping out, he spoke to his phone in Italian. My phone understands me only in Italian, he said with a half smile. He had both in Italy before migrating to Germany. Despite the studio's smallness, its single-room existence, it was seamlessly integrated with digital touch. A tap of his smartphone controlled the lights, the music, the television. From his bed, he could command the room into darkness. When he returned from the restaurant where he works, the speakers would greet him with sound, filling the empty space with presence. Ingrid Richardson and Larissa Hjort's ethnographic research in households demonstrates how mobile media devices such as smartphones are an integral part of spatial organization of the domestic space. They argue that the tactile engagement with mobile media shape or sense of being at home, as they underline ethnography of interactions with digital technologies in a domestic space can give insights about specific life context as digital media impact upon experience of togetherness, proximity, intimacy, or distance. Everyday and banal details such as not looking at smartphones when having dinner with family members, or turning smartphones upside down to create an intimacy when talking to someone, routine and corporeal practices are intertwined with larger social conditions. Similarly, Zainal's everyday repetitive use of interconnected smart technologies give insights about his own life conditions. For Zainal, this digital ecosystem was not just convenience, it was survival, a way to carve out comfort in a life dictated by long hours and little rest, a way to feel in control, even as borders, papers, and economies dictate the terms of his movement. In the absence of community, in the exhaustion of diaspora, his digitally connected home became more than a place. It became a presence, a space that responded, that listened, that understood, a space which he was in control of. Here I have another image, and that is based on one hand on an interview, but on the other hand on my ethnographic observations in the drag queen collective in London. They're called Harem of No One. And I was always interested to understand why they constantly play 1990s Turkish pop music. And they also use 1990s Turkish pop music in their Instagram accounts, but also in their concerts. And so this is the illustration done based on my observation in the interview. And in the interview, Toby Kind, one of the DJs, mentioned, I always remember the Turkish music I listened in my childhood and adolescence. Those cassettes that my family listened to are very clear in my mind. For example, I used to listen to my family's cassette collection again and again. Now when I'm DJing, I mostly play 90s music. We couldn't experience that then because we didn't have independent, those teenagers. We couldn't go to a party and have fun with those songs. Being able to have fun with those songs now makes us live the lost type of view. But it's always like catching up with the time. And suddenly, you know, the irrational thing of playing 1990s music makes sense after this interview, and it ended up illustrating that. But okay, maybe I should jump this. I don't have time. I would like to also talk briefly about this image, and that was more a participatory method. It is an image based on Dostjan, and that's himself. And during the interviews, I asked also the participants to imagine their own migration story as an image. Ask them how they would visualize their own migration story. And Dostjan came up with the idea of a yard, and he mentioned that his own migration story was so messy, but it was always entangled with the places that he left behind. He thought it as a yard. And the artists that I'm collaborating with, in the end, decided to make this image with the participation of Dostjan himself. So created the situation where it was photographed, and then the image was also digitally then created in the end. Yeah, and so maybe a couple of words as a completing remarks. I'm still experimenting with this method, and my aim is to bring together, on one hand, digital media technologies, ethnographic observations, artistic visualization, and participatory methods. I'm trying to find a method that would beautifully bring together all these like different elements. But it has also limitations. It's such a time-consuming process. It's not easy to produce such visual elements as part of the research. It has also ethical issues because it is a generation of the story. In Dos John's case, he took part of it, but in some cases, participants didn't take part of it. But they were asked, they were aware of what kind of visual material he needed to be produced. So that was the way of how I mitigated the ethical challenge in the method. So thank you very much.
I enjoy social.
Yeah.
But also it would be great to pay attention. Usually, all the theory of social capital, they mention that when technology is there, reducing the social capital because people are not interacting. But in the case of migration, we see how technology is.
So particularly in the case that thank you very much for this question, particularly also for queer migration, because most of queer migrants and trans migrants, when they leave their homeland, they leave their homeland without any family member, or in some cases they even escape their family members. They want to create a new network, they want to create a new capital, and it's always entangled with social media, digital technologies. People always use, for instance, dating apps or Instagram or Facebook to connect, not necessarily to find romantic or sexual encounters, but to connect with other diasporic individuals in order to also know where to go, where to find out, your own niche. What?
Collective mental capital.
Exactly. So collective mental capital. And also through all these digital connections, they also share strategies. They share strategies about how to migrate. And this is also, it creates this knowledge which is not easily accessible, and it is only shared through this, private digital communication networks. Thank you. Another question.
Hey, thank you for the interesting presentations. My question is about the participatory aspect, particularly with queer people, the number of social media that queer people is on, just limitless sometimes. It feels like there's always a new one around the corner.
Yeah.
So can you just maybe walk us through about how you select which social media and then, yeah.
It is in the older digital ethnography research, researchers were only focusing on one platform. They were trying to understand, the logic of one platform, but it's not, as you said, it's not possible anymore to only understand a communication structure only based on one platform, because all the platforms are also entangled with each other. People share their YouTube videos, maybe on Twitter or X, and it's all entangled with each other. And I personally like to trace those networks. So I don't focus necessarily on one platform. I try to understand the connections with different platforms and how also these different platforms connect with the physical spaces, such as in the Instagram, like in some of these drag queen shows, the performers ask the audience to turn on their Instagram profile and share pictures. And suddenly that physical interaction turns into a digital interaction. So I'm also trying to understand this connection between online and offline. offline spaces.
Sorry, maybe I was distracted with this one book.
Here's one.
Maybe talk about me, but so could you just tell us how do you involve the participants in the creation, the artists in the visualization of the data? You said at the end, I think they were sort of consulted. How would they vote? Yes, and in general, I think maybe you had the nameless project in the morning, and again about to what extent then are you involved in the kind of understanding throughout the stages of the project.
Thank you. They were from the beginning on aware that one of the outcomes of this research will be visual representations of their own migration story. And the idea is also to create an exhibition base of these illustrations. And I asked the participants if they're okay with it, so I got their informed consent. But I also gave them the option either to produce their own visual material or to collaborate with an artist who is himself a queer migrant. And usually, most of the participants were more keen to collaborate instead of creating their own story as a visual material. And during the creation of the visual material, the artists and the participant were in touch. So they shared ideas, they shared their sometimes also images. And so in that sense, it was also participatory. Although maybe they didn't create the images themselves, the idea was mutually created. So it was a co-authored process.
We're actually running with more time. We're only supposed to go. Good, we can finish preparing. Finish early, or we can keep going longer because we're only supposed to finish at 3 o'clock. So we've maybe excessively cut short Tico. I don't know. But anyhow, we can keep going.
Maybe I can show this one image that I could have. Did I have time?
We can.
You mentioned your research in Berlin and London. I'm very much interested. Okay, then.
Can you speak a bit louder?
Okay, sure. Sorry. I was very much interested to hear more about your participants. I mean, when we say from Turkey, we are looking at diverse communities. We are looking at Kurds, Turks, but also other ethnic groups. We are looking at Muslim and non-Muslim, Alawites, or all these. Would be possible to share something?
Thank you for this question. That's why the title has Turkey's queer diaspora, because there's always a tension. Like from the beginning on, I was like thinking, how can I reflect the diversity of different backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds, and because it was applied, get the grant, and finding the right word was a challenge. But it was also in the end, also in the spaces, it became. I wasn't able to think in a methodological nationalist way because all those spaces, all the queer diaspora spaces, are actually very diverse. There is, for instance, an NGO or an initiative in London called MAKVA, Mesopotamian and Anatolian Queers of Azadi, which is a collective established by Kurdish, Turkish, Cypriot migrants. But they're also open to, open to collaborate with other migrants who come from other countries. Harem of No One, for instance, that is an initiative established by not only Turkish queer migrants, but there are also Cypriot queer migrants, and also someone from Australia with a migration background. So it is very difficult to, particularly if it's a queer diaspora, to only focus on one ethnical belonging or even one language.
They have different experiences.
Exactly.
Also.
And I also see this in their way of defining themselves. It's the same thing that I observe in Berlin. They try to distance themselves from even, they don't call Turkey like in Mesopotamian, Anatolian Queers of Azadi. In Berlin, there's this collective called Queer Lubun Berlin, try to create new wordings in order to distance themselves from nation or from language, but they're also having all like internal discussions and yes, an ongoing negotiations and consultations, and they didn't end up, one definition. So, which I find very exciting. It's very productive. All this, all these ideas.
Okay. May I ask another question?
Also, I'm sorry to include. There was, for instance, in Macros, because as part of the research, I do also ethnography observation in WhatsApp groups, WhatsApp chat groups. There was a tension in a WhatsApp chat group because someone posted something related to Kurdish movement, and then someone who defines himself as Turkish was outraged by this, and this caused a whole tension and debate within the WhatsApp chat group. And so these tensions also happen within, same cases.
Okay, that's very interesting what you say in the last point. And taking Satrio's approach,
Yeah.
and it's not problematical to say Turkey's queer because it's not decolonizing. Indeed, you have again you mentioned the national methodological nationalism, but within this you are putting in this context in the limiting within the national methodology.
Mm-hmm. That's a very good critique, and I totally agree on this. The project had the title of Turkey, but in the publications, I also distance from that wording. I reflect all this, like diversity within the Greek diaspora. It's and also try to reflect all the tensions and disagreements, and I find all those tensions, disagreements productive, as I mentioned at the beginning.
So I think like for me that's also very interesting what you just explained there, because I also kind of like have that kind of tensions between this relationship of ethnic stereotypes and race. And I think at the end, for me, what kind of makes sense is Yasmin so explanation from long time ago about let's just use the category, but then criticize the category based on what we kind of find through the experience of producing this empirical evidence. And what happened to me is that okay, the public health establishment want me to call all of these different kind of ethnic ethno-nationalist groups as Asian born. Okay, I use that. But you'll see in my every publication, I also say that this is racist, this is racist, this is racist. So I'm kind of like using it, and then there's always like in the method section, you'll see like me criticizing in the ethical aspect of it, and I just say that. And I to be quite honest, there's something cathartic about announcing yourself that you're trying to be decolonial, but also you fail doing it. I think there's something more honest in that makes me kind of feel like I'm not responsible of the direction of this particular movement in academia or whatever. Obviously, no one does, but it's like sometimes I feel like the discussion of decolonial kind of goes into the realm of like moral superiority that I don't necessarily particularly interested in. I'm particularly interested in being human and humanizing my participants, and I think that's humanizing myself and humanizing the participants by doing that.
Because there's huge difficulty of breaking out from those categories. Like, you're saying Asian born, that's the state that chooses it. Or state from which somebody, how do you describe it? Let's say, we call it Turkish born, because technically they would be, I'm just saying that it's really difficult. And then another issue, there was a very stupid paper, what name who wrote it, talking about the fact that the ethnicity categories in the UK are not working in the public health sector. Well, no wonder they're not working, because they're completely state-driven.
Yes.
And actually, there's interesting, when you look, I remember looking up, because of a thesis that I was examining, and I happened to look at in the Manchester statistics, and it actually said huge numbers don't fall in, say they're not falling into the categories, but there's no analysis of those people who don't fall into the categories. So then when you start using these ethnic categories, state-imposed ethnic categories, they're wide of the mark. And I think this is, it's something we can talk about critically, but the question is also to shift things. I'm talking about certainly in the public health sector here.
And I guess adding to that as well, Eleanor, I think sometimes it depends on where the researcher is in the career stage within academia. For me, fresh out of PhD, what am I going to do? Change state policies? Bring up the minister and be like, you're doing wrong, my friend.
We did the PhD.
Exactly. I think, but then what I actually was intrigued about in terms of making change because of the nature of the research was in applied science and public health, was that I actually found in my study with the Asian born gay men in Queensland, they actually find a lot more kind of comfort, safety, belonging, less stigmatizing, racial stigma, in a group where it's not just Asians. So they actually love being in a group of HIV positive people who are in it. You got straight people, queer, and then a lot of different ethnicities. They actually find belonging of being a migrants who are kind of struggling because of migration, treat them differently and things like that. And I'm trying to argue for that. And then people in Sydney and Melbourne was like, no, you should just establish what we've done here, which is establish another Asian-born specific groups. And I was like, it's not working in Queensland. You shouldn't universalizing that approach.
This is also what I like about diaspora. Diaspora, if you understand diaspora as a space, it dismantles or messes up with all those categories we use in diaspora. The meaning of those categories shift, and but always there's a tension between because I wrote the project to get funding from European Commission, and you use such categories in order to communicate what you're trying to say, but in the end, in the outcome, you need to then dismantle all those categories, and always reflecting on also, it's always the decolonisation itself is also as a process, and I'm also always critical. What kind of knowledge is not polluted by Western thought or Western epistemologies anyway? So it's always, to reflect on all this, difficult situations because of the legacies of the Western epistemology.
I've got one kind of reflection for all of us, especially those who do research. I mean, why are we using participatory methods and creative methods as a researcher? How important is it for you? We're talking about the importance of giving participants a voice, making them part of it. But why are we it's for obvious reason we use participatory methods, but I'm just wondering on a personal level as a researcher, why do you think it's, how do you think when you use it? I'm just wondering, trying to bring in the researcher into the picture, what is our motivation for using participatory or creative methods, and how do you feel about that?
I think there's a huge power imbalance of a position. Participatory method sort of is an attempt to disrupt the imbalance, because in participatory methodology, the participants that you work with are engaging, they are taking research. It's more participant driven. So there is a lot of co-creation of knowledge that's happening. So I think that's why participants.
I have the same feeling, but also I think we should also, not forget that not every participant necessarily wants to co-create or be the co-author, which I also observed. Not everyone wants to, necessarily create the visual elements. They were, not that much interested in that. So it's, in that sense, we should not always force people if we want to. But we want to create creative methods or use creative or participatory methods. We should, force participants to do something creative.
Sometimes I feel like participatory methods could also like increase the power dynamics because you're asking your participants to do more unpaid labor. So it's more labor. Participants. And the reverse is also possible.
Yeah.
I also think it comes with really great uncertainties. You don't know what you will get.
Yeah.
And we have seen it from the presentations today, that it's really not clear, that untangling, you will get something, but you're not sure, will you be able to untangle it? And, it's quite an unexplored terrain in some ways. I think even more when it comes to analysis, I think collecting is one thing.
I mean, we've raised I think that's been raised, but there's certainly this issue about what we do with the data that we're generating out, and I think we're, coffee.
Oh, God. I think that's sort of right.
Yeah. The question is, it's maybe 3. Should we have made 15 minutes? Not 30.
People go online.